Thank you, Jonathan. I'm so happy to do this nice transfer, passing the baton. Um, I am Jennifer Scarrow. I'm a white woman. I have dark hair and pink glasses, and behind me is a bookshelf full of philosophy and sculptures of mini sculptures of philosophers. I'm really so honored to introduce the next speaker. Lauren Guilmette is an assistant professor of philosophy at Elon University in Central North Carolina, where she teaches courses in feminist philosophy, queer theory, philosophy of disability, philosophy of archives, and other questions of social justice. Before coming to Elon in 2019, she taught at Florida Atlantic University since getting her doctorate from Emory in 2014. Lauren's research engages ethical and political questions of affect, with attention to the contingent histories of whose bodies are considered expressive, intelligible, and empathetic or empathizable. One recent article draws on Sylvia Wynter's work on the coloniality of being / power / truth / freedom. To consider the coloniality of affective expressions. Earlier work following from her dissertation engaged the particular affect of curiosity. Here she drew on the work of Michel Foucault to consider the historical violence of curiosity by way of biopower along the ethic Foucault puts forth of curiosity as care. Aside from these projects, much of Lauren's recent work engages the late feminist philosopher Teresa Brennan on what she called the transmission of affect, the more or less conscious ways in which we pick up and work through the feelings of others. Lauren's most recent publication is an image text piece in the Journal of Speculative Philosophy, which follows Brennan's value for and uptake in recent decolonial queer theory. The images in this piece illustrate some of Brennan's unpublished writings and their contemporary applications through graphic novel and collage formats. Lauren is excited, I am too, about how multimedia work beyond textual argumentation can open the field of philosophy to new modes of accessibility and creativity. And in this case, she's continually inspired by others in this virtual conference space, especially me. Thank you. And Maeve O'Donovan. In this project she's sharing today, Lauren considers what counts as expressive and intelligible affective expression in conversation with new work on neuroqueerness by Nick Walker and Remy Yergo, and she welcomes feedback on this new project.
Thank you so much, Jen. And I see that Damian's here with us. Hi, Damian. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Oh, hello, sorry. Good to see you. I have a tendency to talk fast. So if I start doing that, I really hope that someone will interrupt me and tell me so. I'm going to share, before I share my screen, I'm going to go ahead and briefly describe myself. So my name is Lauren Guilmette. I use she, her pronouns. So to describe myself, I am a petite white woman. I have magenta, pink, curly hair, dark framed glasses. I'm wearing some jewelry that does not necessarily match. I'm sitting in a messy office. I have pictures of some of my favorite authors behind me, including Bell Hooks, Judith Butler, James Baldwin, and Michel Foucault. I want to begin with a brief acknowledgement of the land where I'm speaking. So Elon University is located on the traditional homelands of the Ino, Occaneechi, Saponi, and Shakori peoples. I begin by honoring that this land is home to these peoples and by recognizing the wrongdoings carried out against these peoples and their ancestral lands. The land around me has also witnessed the institution of slavery and its subsequent legacies, including state-sanctioned police violence and mass incarceration that persists today. I begin by contextualizing myself into this history with humility and toward cultivating greater accountability to these harms. So now I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay, and I'm going to share, let's see, oh no, slideshow. There we go. All right, and let's see if I can throw that up there. Okay, so Thank you so much to Shelley and Jonathan for organizing this amazing event. Thank you to Jen for that lovely, for introducing me. It's an honor to be introduced by you. You'll see, as you can see from my title page, that your work figures prominently in this project. So I'm sorry for the unwieldiness of my title as it was printed in the program. I've revised it slightly, but postdisciplinary time still shows up. I'd like to describe this as an effect of my excitability rather than a deficit of focus, but I've revised the title to try to better name what I'm doing here. Neuroqueer phenomenology, or how I am learning to think about attention and affect. The piece of this puzzle about postdisciplinary time, a concept I take from Cressida Hayes' Anesthetics of Existence, wonderful book, 2020, is still super interesting to me in light of the contingent socio-historical framing of attention. And I'll say a little bit about why in conclusion. But the main arc here of what I want to do today is to consider new work in neuroqueer theory by Nick Walker, Remy Yurgo, and others, and how this might deepen and support inquiries in the emerging field of critical phenomenology, especially in dialogue with Sarah Ahmed's queer phenomenology. I'll say a little more about what that is, but the general idea is that I'm learning to think from neuroqueer theory about how some seemingly necessary structures of lived experience, particularly related to affect and attention, may not necessarily be so necessary, or might be more resonantly explored through nonverbal media. I'm really excited to be in community with the folks who are here. I've learned so much from folks who are here, and again, I warmly welcome feedback. I hope my pacing is so far okay. I've not been interrupted, so I'm going to keep going. Let's see, now I will move this over here. I'll move it around. Let's see, there we go. So recently, this paper began, I've been thinking about this paper for about the last year. So recently in 2019, last in-person conference I went to, SPEP 2019, I gave a paper that drew on Sylvia Wynter's framing of the coloniality of what she calls being, power, truth, and freedom to consider affective expressions. In the Q&A that followed my presentation, Dr. Alison Ryheld suggested that a compelling parallel question alongside this question of decolonial feminism and affect would be to ask about the neuronormativity of affective expressions, particularly as these expectations materialize in the lives of some autistic and other neurodivergent people. Dr. Ryheld and I talked more after the panel, and I've been thinking about this and trying to find readings about this ever since. I encountered Yurgo's text soon after, and their hilarious and devastating prose felt like a cosmic answer to my questions. The term neuroqueerness was coined by Nick Walker and Athena Lynn Michaels Dillon in 2008, in or around there, and developed in conversation with other autistic bloggers, including Remy Yurgo, whose 2018 text, Authoring Autism, is where I first encountered the term. These authors define the term primarily as a verb, a practice of disruption with respect to hetero and neuronormativity. Still, they acknowledge from the start that some would claim neuroqueer as an adjective, a self-descriptor for themselves. And the authors do not, by any stretch, disallow this. They do root their own primary understanding of the term as a verb. So while difficult to define, the term can speak to all kinds of neurodivergence, including autism, ADD, ADHD, and mental illness, but it is a self-identifying term rather than a label for others. This is not to conflate or reduce these diagnoses to one another, but to reframe neurodivergence affirmatively and to generate new spaces of solidarity. This affirmative renaming garners urgency in the chilling history Yurgo provides of applied behavioral analysis, ABA, used on autistic and gender variant children to render them, quote unquote, indistinguishable from their peers. As Yurgo writes of these methods, quote, in order to normalize one's brain or to train one's cerebral self into productive mental health, one must reduce and dissect her every behavioral motion into elements that can be extinguished or reinforced. We are compelled to rewire our neural circuits for the social good of the body politic ad infinitum, end quote. I'll reread that last sentence again. I really like it. We are compelled to rewire our neural circuits for the social good of the body politic ad infinitum, end quote. To be normal is to be useful, to fit and find comfort within the functioning of the body politic. This behaviorist logic feeds our compulsory usefulness, our postdisciplinary productivity as neoliberal subjects. So Walker's book came out on November 29th, really, really recently. So I've only just read it and I've not thoroughly processed her insights yet. I'm really excited about them. About this use of neuroqueer as a verb. And so I want to give you her 8-point definition. She offers 8 points of definition about what neuroqueerness means. Let's see, that'll work. So 8 points of agreement. And so this definition has been affirmed also by Yergo and Athena Lynn Michael Stone. So the 8 points that Nick Walker includes under this definition are: first, awareness of how queerness and neurodivergence are interwoven in one's experiences, expressing neurodivergence in ways that also queer gender and other aspects of identity, subverting one's cultural conditioning and ingrained habits of neuro and heteronormative performance, intentionally altering one's own neurocognitive processing to increase one's divergence from norms, approaching and embodying one's neurodivergence as a form of queerness or queer activism, producing literature, art, scholarship, and the like that foreground neuroqueer experiences and voices, relatedly producing critical responses to the above literature, art, and the like, and how these relate to lived experiences. Especially lived experiences of neurodivergent people. And lastly, working to transform social and cultural environments of support. And so one thing I really like about this term, I find that the term is really, really generously inclusive. So Walker's framing is really inclusive. She's disinterested in policing who does or doesn't count in this self-naming category. But this inclusiveness here is distinct from her other very careful terminology. For instance, Walker also coined the word neurominority, which describes structural oppression on the basis of neurodivergence. So I find these new words really helpful. I can't wait to teach this book. And I'm finding it really provocative, thinking about these insights of neuroqueerness in line with Sarah Ahmed's queer phenomenology, which I've been thinking about for some time, especially in relationship to gender, sexuality, and disability. So, next slide. Let's see, there we go. So these insights can be elaborated further, I think, with reference to Sarah Ahmed, who writes in Queer Phenomenology that queer denotes not an identification or stable kind of being. This bears comparison to Nick Walker's definition of neuroqueer, but rather an orientation, how we align or refuse to align with the cultural expectations of straightness. And I really like this quote from page 13 of Queer Phenomenology. So Ahmed writes, "We have our bearings, and these include not only personal memories, but also cultural expectations of what bodies will do, such that what is presented as a choice of alternatives is generally framed with a right way to turn. The social depends in part on agreement about how we measure space and time, which is why social conflict can often be experienced as being out of time, as well as out of place with others." And then Ahmed takes up the phenomenological tradition in her book, Queer Phenomenology, for insights into what it might mean to take up an orientation over time, which is never neutral or natural, but learned in a social space sedimented with histories. This method enables Ahmed to productively frame discourses of quote unquote happiness as promises of social goods directed towards certain objects and relations presumed to be the source of good feeling. This is perfectly summed up when the queer, neurodivergent, or otherwise different subject reflects on the times one has been told, quote, "I just want you to be happy," and what all was at stake in the question for the person who said it. Ahmed asks productively for a neuroqueer phenomenology. How can we theorize positive affects and the politics of good feeling from the vantage point of those who have often been considered causes of bad feeling. And as I said a moment ago, I've been thinking about queer phenomenology in light of disability studies for a little while now. And I've mostly thought about that thus far in relation to Rosemary Garland Thompson's concept of the misfit, which Sarah Ahmed herself returns to in her 2019 book, What's the Use? But I'm curious, I'm curious about this idea of neuroqueerness in relationship to queer phenomenology. And I think that something else might arise there. Here, I'm also really interested in Shelley Tremaine's critique of Rosemary Garland Thompson's concept of the misfit in her 2017 book on feminism and Foucault and the feminist philosophy of disability. I'm interested in how this concept of neuroqueerness might be more provocative when we're thinking about cognitive disabilities, cognitive differences, mental illness. And yeah, so I'm really interested in what this new notion of neuroqueerness might introduce to how we approach queer phenomenology from the paradigm of neurodiversity. So phenomenology, I think, offers tools for this counter-narration. We may be familiar with the phrase critical phenomenology. So critical phenomenology can potentially assist in telling other parts of the story. As Lisa Gunther explains of that word, the critical and critical phenomenology diverges from the classical by taking seriously the contingent or non-necessary formation of institutions and practices that condition lived experience. Critical phenomenology can analyze systemic forms of oppression like white supremacy and heteronormativity as quote unquote quasi-transcendental structures of consciousness. As Gunther puts it, quote, ways of making the world that go unnoticed without a sustained practice of critical reflection, unquote. And that quote is from her piece in 50 Concepts for a Critical Phenomenology. Yourgo importantly shows how the quasi-transcendental structures of ableism delimit a range of what counts as rhetoric, and with that, relationality and legitimate expression. Their book performatively subverts the medicalized storytelling of autism as lack in cognitive studies scholarship. As they summarize, as Yourgo writes, what's at risk here is who gets to tell my story. Who gets to determine whether we are, in fact, narrative creatures, end quote. So why phenomenology? Here I turn to the work of my good friend and interlocutor, who is also part of this conference, Jennifer Skiro. So as Skiro describes it, and I have here, I'll spend a little bit of time describing images. I just realized I've been forgetting to describe my images, and I apologize about that. I'm a very visual person, but one thing that I've been thinking and learning a lot about, especially with this neuroqueerness literature, is images are more accessible to me. I need to describe those images to others, but I'm also really interested in how images might be incorporated into philosophical work to make that work more accessible to someone like me, who's more ready to think in an image. But image descriptions, important. So just briefly, why phenomenology? So I really love how Skiro describes the usefulness of phenomenology as a method that offers a means for disentangling, as she puts it, our snapshot memories into the narrative against the plot of a master narrative. So this work of bringing the quote unquote objective timeline into conversation with one's own lived subjective experience of events, taking that lived experience seriously. In the paper she just gave before me, Skiro uses phenomenology to describe the limits of what is speakable at the limits of becoming unwell. So Skiro's work on diagnosis, the transmission of affect, and the value of self and counter-diagnosis, I find really resonates with Yourgo's thinking about the framing of rhetoric and intelligibility. It's pivotal to Yourgo's claim that neuroqueer orientations are empowered to speak for and about themselves beyond diagnostic and other taxonomizing discourses about them. Against the neoliberal demand to be productive, to move on, to keep working, I admire that Skiro engages in grief work and that she does so publicly in ways that hold space for her own grief and for that of others. This is what Skiro, in addressing ableism, and as mentioned in her talk just now, calls the work of enmembering, or holding space. So as she puts it, each member, otherwise dismembered, otherwise disposed, instead can have place and context for not just being, merely existing or surviving, but rather prosthetically sustaining a generous, persistent partiality of belonging in the world. In her scholarly as well as her artistic practice, Skiro pushes on the limits of what philosophy can do and what philosophical expression looks like. Inspired by Skiro, I'm interested in how non-traditional forms of writing and drawing might make the philosophical work that I'm doing more accessible and or more precisely be able to get at relevant phenomena. So just to describe the images available, or the images depicted here. So at the top, I have a self-portrait that Jennifer Skiro made of herself. It's part of a series that she did where, as we mentioned in the previous talk that she just gave, she did these really beautiful, evocative portraits of feminist philosophers alongside their own words, really mediated by their own words. And I thought that this series was so interesting for lots of reasons. For one thing, we encounter somebody's words in this relatively, not neutral, I guess, but sort of dispassionate way as words on a page. And seeing those words alongside the face of the person who spoke them or who articulated them just brings a different connection to the words themselves. Which I really find interesting and admire. I also include one image from Skiro's graphic novel, The Pregnancy Does Not Equal Childbearing Project, which is a phenomenological exploration of her own experience with miscarriage. I find this image so evocative because it captures this experience of doctors talking about her, medical professionals talking about her, but not to her. And I think there's a way that that image gets at that experience in a way that I'm not sure any set of words so precisely could. So I'm really interested in that. And then down below are, oops, sorry, I accidentally went ahead. Down below are two of Jen Skiro's book covers, Addressing Ableism, Philosophical Questions via Disability Studies. And then to the right, again, is her graphic novel, The Pregnancy Does Not Equal Childbearing Project, which is a book that I have sent to countless friends at this point as they have gone through this experience that I myself have not experienced, but I find something in Jen's work that speaks to the experiences of my friends in a way that I don't have words for. And that again gets at something of what I find so striking about doing philosophy in this visual medium. Okay, to keep going. How am I on time? Oh, okay, I'm gonna go a little faster. Okay, next slide. So more artwork. So here I have 3 portraits that Jen Skiro completed in the last few years. One is of Maeve O'Donovan, who is also part of this wonderful conference. She spoke on Tuesday. And again, her words are mediated by her face, by an image of her face smiling. She has curly hair. The images are really, I should describe more about how the images are done. So they are not in color. The color is really light blues and purples, very sparse, but very evocative. And again, I have Skiro's self-portrait depicted here. And to the right of that, I have Skiro's portrait of Davanya Havis, who is a very dear friend and mentor of mine, again, mediated by her own written work. Havis has short hair. She is a Black woman with glasses. She's wearing an earring on the side of her ear that's visible. Skiro, again, in the middle, is wearing large dark glasses. Below these 3 images, so if you follow, as I do, Shelley Tremaine's Dialogues and Disability series, you may have seen some of these artworks in recent Dialogues on Disability with Dr. O'Donovan O'Donovan and Dr. Skiro. Below is a collage that Dr. O'Donovan made, a watercolor collage with, I believe it is 5 figures in a kind of a forest scene. And they are moving spritefully in a variety of embodiments with very bright colors. To the right are some of Skiro's portraits of feminist philosophers. Again, I took this from the Dialogues on Disability posting that Shelley did, I believe, over the summer. It might have been in late spring. And here, some of the philosophers depicted are also people that I know and deeply admire. My good friend Rebecca Longton is right up here in the corner, Falguni Sheth, Lydia X.C. Brown. So I admire how I see Dr. Skiro doing this processing work of reading people and thinking with them in this visual imagistic way that allows for a different kind of connection. And I've been really inspired by that in my own process of thinking about how I want to bring visual work into my philosophizing and what I might mean by a neuroqueer phenomenology. So I'll go back to my written paper and stop describing. So, I also want to add, so much as Leisha Carlson, I think really smartly earlier today clarified, right, that she's not restricting the value of arts for the philosophy of disability just to music, right? And I hear these resonances as well in Jonathan Wolf's project around musical therapy, right? The point is not to say that this work needs to be visual. Far from it, right? I mean, if this work was only visual, it would be exclusionary to people with visual impairments for whom I have been inadequately describing the images. But for others who connect to work much more quickly through images, it's exciting to me to think about what other insights might be possible, who else might feel welcome to the table. So I don't want to say by any stretch that philosophical work should be done through visual art or that visual art has some kind of exclusive hold, but I think much like music, visual art allows for other kinds of expression to be possible. So along these lines, I'm also really interested in recent work by Nick Susannas, whose 2015 graphic novel, Unflattening, is really exciting to me. I only discovered that in the last few months. And to that, I'm grateful to my colleague in communications, Saujana Kudva, who introduced me to that book. But so in Nick Susannas's work, he uses drawing, as he puts it, not to simplify ideas, but to make them more accessible. His 2015 book, Unflattening, again, right, philosophical graphic inquiry that insists on a plurality of means and methods through which to process our experiences. As he writes, we find ourselves confined, and he also really beautifully depicts this in the image on the bottom left here. We find ourselves confined, quote, boxed into bubbles of its own making, row upon row, thought and behavior aligned in a single dimension. And so I think Susannas's work is really interesting to me because he's thinking about how visual work allows us to move beyond the linearity of written argumentation. And I think it's really interesting that Nick Susannas has actually done workshops around comics and cartoon drawing. He did one at a recent neurodiversity conference in 2018. So he is also thinking quite a bit about how this work might be more accessible. He's also recently been doing work around comics for the blind and visually impaired. So again, I think there's really interesting work happening at the limits of visual accessibility. I don't want to say that this is some kind of new, be all end all means of access, but I think what Susannas is suggesting is that when we offer more ways in, the conversation is more interesting, that we can unflatten, ideally, our philosophical approach. So those of us who are used to seeing, right, I think at this conference and in other accessible spaces, are learning how to make image descriptions, which shows our own unflattening capacity. And I'm interested in how we might pluralize this unflattening. Now, in saying that, I want to be careful that I don't want to romanticize or capitalize on the neurodiversity paradigm as a means of somehow better extracting labor or participation from everyone, right? Like what I'm not saying is, oh, let's engage in multiple media so that we can get everybody's good ideas on the table. Though I could see how that might be an effect of what I'm saying. I'm a little worried about that. What I'm interested in is broadening how we conceive of participation so that more people can show up and contribute. So some other spaces that I've been seeing this work happening, and I'm really close to the end here. I recognize it is time to wrap up. So another space where I've seen this work happening in really exciting ways is in a recent collection, graphic medicine. So there's a graphic medicine conference that happens annually, and a recent volume adjacent to that conference called Pathographics that came out last year. And in that piece, there's a number of really interesting chapters I've been learning from, but a couple that I want to draw attention to. So Ariella Friedman's piece, The Comic Pain Scale and Comics About Pain, engages the recent history of cartoon faces to express levels of pain qualitatively, and engages critiques and alternative scales made by disabled artists and chronic pain sufferers, folks with chronic pain, to explore how this scale in fact limits rather than expands one's capacity to express that pain. But what's really interesting about that is the chronic pain scale limits our capacity to express pain in order to communicate and streamline treatment and engagement with medical professionals. And so Friedman thinks in really compelling ways about the advantages of that and also the limits of that. The pain scale is incredibly limited for expressing the complexities of pain, but when might that be useful? So I found Friedman's thinking about the pain scale in comics to be really fascinating. I'm also really drawn to Maureen Burdock's work. So Maureen Burdock does a lot of work around the transgenerational transmission of trauma. And draws inspiration from Hannah Hoch's collages. So Hannah Hoch was in the Dada era, or she was a Dada artist, and she tore magazines and newspapers to explore the trauma and fragmentation following World War I experiences, and thinking about how collage here, right, as a making through cutting and tearing, could express something that words couldn't. And so Burdock has been doing really interesting work with hair and braiding and thinking about what gets transmitted through generations. And again, I find something there that I think exceeds words in a way that I find really compelling. So last, I'm going to share a little bit of what I've been doing. I'm going to check the chat. Yeah, okay. So this is my last slide. So this is just some of the work that I've been doing. So how I've been learning to think about attention and affect in my own work. So both of these came out in my recently published piece in the Journal of Speculative Philosophy, my image text piece, Thinking with Teresa Brennan. So first on the left, I have a visual meditation on the impact of societal norms and forces on the feminized body. So Teresa Brennan elaborates that these are historically often women, these feminized bodies, but the disposition and direction of the negative affects varies when racism, homophobia, ableism, and other systemic forms of violence are at play. So what I'm thinking about here is how the depletion of this feminine strength originates from without, as embodied in an Amazon warrior as she holds her shield against the onslaught. And so I'm playing here with my own marker drawing and collage, while I'm also cutting up texts by Teresa Brennan and also Julietta Singh in her recent work, No Archive Will Restore You. And then on the other side, I have, so this piece is called What I Feel and What I Feel With Are Distinct. And I was trying to think about Teresa Brennan's distinction of affect and feeling, and I'll keep this brief. I can talk more about it if folks are interested, but I was trying to think about how to describe how a mood in a room or how a kind of feeling hits you, and then you also take that up and interpret it. I don't know if the visual gets to that better than words, but I sure do come up at the limits of clear expression when I try to say it in words. The other image that I have here is a gendered revision to the 1960s Milton Bradley game operation with its iconic broken heart and butterflies, but with also with two new accessory ailments debilitated in the last year by US conservative efforts to undo Roe v. Wade and restrict access to reproductive health care. The red tweezers of the electroprobe, attached by a wire to the game board, offer the only means of grasping and removing these sites of trauma. And even then, the ailment-shaped hole remains. So here I was thinking with Julietta Singh's recent work about the body as an archive, and I was thinking a lot about news over the last year, and I was trying to put those feelings somehow into a visual form that could better get at those tensions, those ambivalences. And so in conclusion, I'm gonna really, actually, I might just skip my conclusion. I'll just say really quickly, so I returned just briefly to Cressida Hayes on postdisciplinary time. So this practice for me of printing out texts that I'm reading, cutting them up, and making drawings with them is helping me in small everyday ways to wriggle out of my socialization as an anxious multitasker, as somebody who's very good at adhering to what Cressida Hayes describes as postdisciplinary time, a kind of multitasking, anxious inseparability of work and life. And I've learned, that this adherence to postdisciplinary time, which is a kind of anxiety, a kind of, which I would say further provokes the difficulties with managing attention. All of this is in service of late liberal capitalism. And I'm really interested in how this process of drawing slows me down. And I'm also really interested just generally to conclude in all the things I think we've learned from the pandemic, right? The pandemic has been awful in so many ways, but I'm grateful for the fact that we're in a Zoom conference right now. I'm grateful for the kinds of community that have arisen in the last year as everything got interrupted. And I hope that as we move back toward the reinstatement of the quote unquote normal and everyday that we take from these habits in the last year. I hope that we keep having conferences in virtual spaces where they're financially accessible and bodily accessible and just accessible in all kinds of ways that they didn't used to be. And I just want to conclude by thanking Shelley Tremaine and Jonathan Wolfe so much for organizing this beautiful event, and for Jennifer Skiro and Maeva Donovan, beautiful artwork inspiring me over the last year. Thank you.
Okay. Let's have a round of applause or other comparable celebratory gestures for Professor Guilmette, everyone. Thank you, Professor Guilmette. It's good to see you and finally be engaging with you beyond email. I apologize for being 2 minutes late. I was just 2 minutes late. Anyway, computer issue. So I also would like to thank Jonathan Wolfe and Shelley Tremaine for organizing this fantastic conference and meeting of the minds. I'd like to thank everybody who has joined and participated in this final panel of the conference. I'm sorry, my name is Davian Scott. I'm an adjunct assistant professor here at the City University of New York, at the City College of New York, coming to you live from Harlem, USA. So very specifically in terms of the Q&A, everybody, we have roughly about 10 minutes. I will ask a brief question myself now, and then we will open up the floor for all questions and comments we have for Professor Guilmette and that fantastic presentation on neuroqueerness and its relation to queer phenomenology and alternative practices when it comes to understanding the variously abled and contextual situations of the expression of so-called queerness amongst the community of the variously abled. My specific question, and I hate to disappoint, Professor Guilmette, given that you had already mentioned something about earlier in the talk about not wanting to merely just kind of run up against, recognize the limits of language. But one thing I do want to ask, given my almost complete agreement with much of your prescriptive force of your thought, of your ideas, and the collaborative force of many of the authors and thinkers that you had referenced in your talk. Unfortunately, perhaps the kind of old-fashioned project or the reformation of language might be helpful, all right, when it comes to helping us to have the rhetorical resources to convince others, especially, excuse me, others in positions of power to be more sensitive and more willing and able to recognize queerness, especially in terms of so-called psychiatrically divergent or abnormally psychological phenomena. So my specific question, given that little quick setup, is, the idea of neuroqueerness and the idea of a queer phenomenology, right? Let's bracket the queer modifier, right? Which I'm, again, no disagreement, but in terms of the neural queerness in relation to phenomenology, then we have a bit of an issue. In terms of neural phenomena, for the most part, the history of the discipline informs us that, neural phenomena are, for the most part, thematized and investigated and explained, all right, in terms of an objective assessment of the noetic content in the phenomena. Basically, a fancy way of saying they're pretty natural, and there is an imperative to go ahead and unsuspend the natural attitude when you talk about neurology or neural functionality. This type of tool use sense of neural phenomena as essential as self for selves, as essential for actual self experience, runs up against the kind of more conducive to lived experience understanding of phenomenology as in terms of critical phenomenology and Naiman's notion as being essentially intersubjective amongst a subordinated group and subjective in terms of differential power dynamics of self in relation to the chosen community and self in relation to thrownness in the world. So I'm going to ask the question in here very simply: do you think that there might be a problem in reception of neuroqueerness as opposed to something like psychological queerness, or again, phenomenal queerness, given the neural aspect of it and the history of the term, plus the methodology often used? We're going to have to convince a lot of psychiatrists and psychologists to get on board at some point. And that's my question. Thank you. Sorry it took so long.
No, thank you. That was a wonderful question, Davian. I mean, the first thing that came to my mind, so I remember, at first I was thinking, I don't think that I think your classical phenomenology, I'm not sure can accommodate neuroqueerness. I think that that's absolutely true. I think when I'm thinking, I'm really thinking here much more of recent work in critical phenomenology by Lisa Gunther, Gail Solomon, Jennifer Scuro, Sarah Ahmed. But I guess the other piece that's really interesting to me about the definition of neuro, and I don't know if this speaks to the concern, but Nick Walker is very careful to say that neuro does not just mean brain, it means nerves. And that strikes me as really interesting, right? When we think about philosophy as a sensory motor activity, we tend to frame it as something in which, you perceive and then you cognize and then you make arguments. And if it's the case that our whole sensory motor apparatus might approach that differently, how do the expectations of publication and what publications look like constrain the kinds of ideas that are expressed? So one thing that's interesting to me here too is that these ideas of neuroqueerness that I'm coming across I'm not finding them in traditional scholarly publications. So I would say the most traditional place I find them is in Remy Yurgo's book, which is, full of curse words and hilarious. There's something very non-traditional. This is Nick Walker's new book, which I just love. And it's published by Autonomous Press. I would say this work is not coming out in the mainstream. And maybe that's in part my own. I'm really drawn to what this work is doing. And I guess maybe I'm thinking to myself, I think that the dominant discourse of philosophy might be better off for learning how to engage in these ways. I also find myself then thinking about, I think, Shelley Tremaine's really excellent critique of bioethics. Maybe we don't need to go bring neuroqueerness into the dominant discourse. Maybe actually that would spoil something. I don't know. I'm just thinking off the top of my head, but I really, I really appreciate your question. I'm not sure if I answered it effectively.
More than sufficiently. Thank you. And also, I forgot. I want to give a physical verbal description of myself. I'm a cisgendered male, brown complexion, identifies Jamaican American, African American. And yes, I apologize about the lack of description earlier. We have several questions here. Let's go ahead and move on. Fantastic questions for Professor Guilmette. We have, so sorry, everyone. Jeez. Thank you. Okay, all right. Geez, sorry. Amazon, you can't get rid of the late capitalistic power structures. Okay, Morgan, they, them. So we have a question from Morgan. If people have never tried these kinds of artist scholarly ways of thinking and expressing before, how would you recommend people start, and where should we start? Because I don't know about anyone else, but I really want to try this. Thank you very much, Morgan, for that fantastic question. Professor Guilmette, would you like to field each question individually? Would you like me to read out 2 or 3 and just try? Let's go individually, I believe that might be best. So that's the first question for Morgan. Sure. What are some resources to start?
Yeah, I love this question. Thank you, Morgan. So one thing I did actually with my students this year that I found really generative, I think it was really generative for them too. So we have a really nice, it's a nice used bookstore in town, and I'm really obsessed with buying old sets of encyclopedias. So, if you go to a used bookstore, you can sometimes get 25 encyclopedias for $30 or something, and so I went to the used bookstore and I got this set from 1974 called Understanding Human Behavior, and it's hilarious. It's also from 1974, so in a lot of ways it's very progressive in ways that we're sort of, prudishly shocked by, but also it's talking about a lot of sort of the public discourse around health and human behavior in the 70s. And so we cut that up, we used it as collage material, we played with it. And what was really interesting to me was to see how my different students took up the same material. Sometimes they were drawn to, for instance, images of gender performance and sort of, coloring on those, disrupting those, or finding images they were using affirmatively. So I think the best first thing to do is find a really ratty old set of used books and cut them up. You don't have to, I used to be able to draw. Jennifer Scuro can draw, and I admire that so much. And I think I could if I practiced, but drawing has a kind of hand-eye coordination skill capacity that collage, I think, is more inviting. So I would say start with collage because there's so much to play with. And I also really like photocopying. This is something I sneak into my department and photocopy pages for art. So, if you have the privilege of being attached to an institution, I think that's a great thing to do, or hopefully your public library is affordable.
Thank you for that. Fantastic. Next question from Emily. We have a comment from Emily Douglas. Thank you, Lauren. This gives so many things to chew on, and I love your work's directions. Thank you. And then we have Jane Dryden. Thank you so much, Lauren. I really enjoyed your talk and its various connections. I've been scrolling down the titles of many of the texts you brought up. I don't have a question, so I'm just leaving this here. But I want to thank you so much for so much to think about. Okay, we have a question from Maeve O'Donovan on the borrowed computer. Thank you so much, Lauren. Wow, I'm so touched and moved. Recently, I've been talking to my brother who was laid off thanks to COVID and is trying to reconstitute himself by returning to making music. When he saw me listed as unaffiliated in this conference, he said he finally felt he had found a word for himself, unaffiliated, as in a creative, and as in no being boxed in by his former identities. My question is, could you say more about how and why this nonverbal work should be included in philosophy rather than perhaps being, quote, unaffiliated?
Such a good question. And that's something I was wrestling with at the end. I want to bring it, I feel unconflicted about bringing this kind of work into my classroom. I feel absolutely unconflicted about that. In the last year, in the last couple of years, I've learned so much from my good friend at Elon, who is an archivist, Libby Coiner. And Libby has taught me a lot about the history of zines zines and zine activism. And so I've been teaching my students about, non-traditional modes of publication. And I mean, one problem that we run into when we make zines is, at first, I would get these things from students that looked kind of like super pre-professional brochures, and very professional brochures. And I would say that's the risk of affiliation, right? Bringing the knowledge of something like the radical history of zines and zine activism into a mainstream classroom and having students sort of present little, info sheets that are sort of depoliticized or not really in the spirit of zines. And so I worry about, in that way about bringing this history in. I'm not sure, I want to give all of my students access to expressing themselves in plural ways. I think though, I've really tried to stress to them that zines are not just, right? They're not just picture books. They're not just brochures. They're doing something radical by self-publication and with the combining of image and text. I would say, yeah, so I don't know. I mean, I'm ambivalent about it. I would say when I think about the kind of academic world that I want my students to encounter, when I think about the things that have kept me going in this field, the reasons why I've wanted to stay in it, it's been this kind of multimedia activity. But I'm not sure that, I don't know, I guess I would say I want to make space for it, but I'm not sure that the life doesn't get sucked out of it by bringing it into the mainstream. So I think that's really complicated. But yeah, I mean, I would say for myself, I have a deeper understanding of what I'm talking about if I work through it by making a collage. And I find that's true for my students too. Now, I don't want to make a universal claim. I think, there's lots of different ways that material might be accessible to us, but I think there's something in that exercise that, yeah, I mean, I want to keep exploring out. I'm rambling, I'll stop, but thank you. Thank you for the question.
Thank you. And it seems like the last question, unfortunately, I wish we had more time, but last question from Isaac Jiang. Dr. Guilmette, thank you. I love everything about this. This is a bit of a half-baked question, and I apologize. But one thing I'm interested in is between Brennan's discussion of affect and Yergo's discussion of rhetoric, both seem to be fairly atmospheric notions that potentially reveals the ways space can be constructed in regulative ways. And I was wondering if you could speak to any potential connection between these two things.
I love that question. That's an awesome question. Thank you, Isaac. I've been thinking a lot about, so I'll say the thing that I've been really stuck on as I've been reading Brennan and Yergo is I've been wondering, let's see, I tried to write this out somewhere. Let me see if I actually, because it's tricky. Yeah, okay, I find myself wondering. So Teresa Brennan talks about feeling the mood in the room, right? Feeling a mood in the room. That's the famous first line of transmission of affect. Frankly, a lot of the scholarship, I mean, Jen Sciro knows I complain about this a lot, but like Jen's book is one of the only books that engages Teresa Brennan's work past like the first 8 pages. Like most people quote the, has somebody ever felt the mood in a room, and then engage her on the basis of that. But with that line, I worry, is feeling the mood in a room what Yergo would call an allistic expectation. So allism names, it kind of like neurotypicality names the quote unquote norm against which neurodivergence is measured. Some autistic scholars are using this word allism to talk about sort of a different way of talking about non-autism, right? Or sort of modes of engagement that are neurotypical. And so I worry that feeling the mood in a room is an allistic expectation. And I'm not sure. I suspect for a lot of Western history, and for many still, that actually feeling a mood in a room could err on psychosis or projection. I don't think that feeling a mood in a room is a neurotypical thing, but I'm worried about what it presumes. And I would say the next step of what I really want to do is to think across what I'm encountering, these new ideas I'm encountering in Yergo and Walker with Brennan's theory of affect. Now, Teresa Brennan died, she was in a coma at the end of 2002 and she was dead in early 2003. And so, when she died, a lot of the rich language that we have now didn't exist yet. So her work does not really necessarily have the resources to articulate a neurodivergent affect theory. But I think thinking about her with your go could be really provocative in that way. And I love how you put this point about how space is constructed in regulative ways. So one thing I think about there, you know, I remember seeing this. I was with Jen Skiro at this instance too, at my first Society for Disability Studies conference in 2015. And I remember in the panel, panelists saying something like, you know, do whatever you need to do during this panel. You know, you can lay down on the ground, you can walk out, you can walk around. And I didn't personally feel the need to do any of those things, but I found the offer so, I don't know, welcoming. And so I do think, you know, I think that there are all kinds of expectations, for instance, of how my students move in spaces. And I want to, you know, lately I've been teaching outside, and that enables different kinds of movement. So I really want to think more about that. I don't think I have a good answer. I don't think it's a half-baked question. I think it's a really interesting question, and thank you.
Okay, and with that, again, I'd like to thank everyone and the main organizers, Professor Jonathan Wolf, Shelley Tremaine, our presenter, Professor Lauren Guilmette, and all of the attendees and interlocutors. We have Professor Guilmette has posted the PowerPoint in the chat, and if anyone needs help with facilitating access to that, we can certainly provide that. And I would like to wish everyone a good rest of their day, evening, wherever they are, and a good continuation of these valuable projects in the philosophy of disability and in the larger context of the phenomenological school of thought and critical thinking in general. So thank you, Professor Guilmette, and thank you all. And I hope all of you have a good rest of your day. Take care.
Thanks so much, Davian. And Lauren, amazing talk. And Jen, thank you also for starting us off as well in this rather unconventional panel, as it turned out, but an amazing end to the session.